Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely, ready to explore.
Awesome. Today, we're diving into something pretty essential. Food.
More than just what we eat, right?
Exactly. We're looking at food resources, how we get it, the challenges, and what the future holds. It's a big topic, lots to uncover.
Definitely a complex system, impacts everything from the environment to, well, keeping us alive.
Okay, so first things first. Why IS food so important? I mean, beyond just tasting good and all that.
It's the fuel our bodies run on, literally the building blocks for growth, development, you name it.
So not just satisfying hunger, but the actual ingredients for a functioning human.
Exactly. Think of it as the raw materials and energy our bodies can't do without.
And those raw materials, they mainly come from plants and animals, am I right?
You got it. That's where agriculture and animal husbandry step in, the foundation of our food supply.
Makes sense. But speaking of supply, got to talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay.
Population
Really?
growth. More people means more mouths to feed.
A huge challenge, no doubt, especially when we can't just keep expanding farmland forever.
True, especially in a place like India where land is already precious. Got to work with what we got.
Exactly. That means getting more out of our existing farmland, which brings us to, well, improving crop yields.
Okay, so yields, crops. Let's break it down. We have different types of crops, right? Each with their own role to play.
Right. Cereals, our main carbohydrate source. Think wheat, rice, all that. Then there's pulses packed with protein, lentils, beans, that sort of thing. And of course, oil seeds for fats, your soybeans, sunflower seeds, all those.
So like a balanced diet, but on a grand scale. Now, how do we actually boost the yields of these essential crops? Where do we even begin?
It all boils down to three key stages: how we pick the seeds, how we nurture those plants, and how we protect them from things that can hurt them.
So like a three-pronged approach to maximizing output.
Exactly. And these stages translate into three focus areas: improving the crop variety itself, improving how we actually grow the crops, and then managing the protection side of things.
Okay, let's start with that first one. Improving crop variety. What does that involve exactly?
Think of it as developing super crops, varieties that are high-yielding, tough against diseases, and can handle different climates and soils.
So we're talking about breeding plants for peak performance, basically.
Exactly. And one of the main tools in our toolbox is hybridization. It's where we cross plants with different genetics, kind of like building a dream team with the best traits from each.
Interesting. So hybridization is like strategic matchmaking for plants. But what about GMOs? Genetically modified crops, where do they fit in?
With GMOs, we're talking about directly tweaking a plant's genes, maybe to make it extra resistant to pests or bump up its nutritional content.
So more of a targeted, direct approach to genetic modification. Okay, I get it. But when breeders are trying to make a better crop, what are they even looking for? What makes one variety better than another?
Well, obviously, higher yield is at the top of the list. We want to squeeze as much food out of each piece of land as possible.
Makes sense. More food, more people fed.
But it's not just about quantity. Quality matters, too. Think better: baking wheat, pulses packed with more protein, oil seeds with healthier fats. You get the idea.
So it's a balancing act. Quantity and equality. Anything else on the ideal crop checklist?
Oh, definitely. We need crops that can roll with the punches. Both biotic stresses, those are pests and diseases, and abiotic stresses, like droughts or crazy temperatures.
Resilience, gotta have it. Anything else? Or are we done with this checklist?
Almost. Shorter maturity duration's another big one. If we can get crops from seed to harvest faster, farmers can grow more rounds in a year. More efficient, more output overall.
So speed, A&D, resilience. Got it. What else?
Wider adaptability. If a crop can thrive in different climates and soils, it means more regions can grow it. More food security all over.
Right, because not every place has perfect farmland. So adaptable crops are key. Anything else? I feel like we're forgetting something.
One last thing: desirable agronomic characteristics. Basically, traits that make the plant easier to manage and harvest. Like dwarf varieties of cereals, they need fewer nutrients, but still give a good yield. And they're less likely to fall over, which makes harvesting a lot smoother.
So it's not just about what the plant produces, but how it actually, behaves in the field. Practical stuff.
Exactly. It all adds up.
Okay, before we move on, can we, sum up what crop variety improvement is? Just so everyone's on the same page?
Sure. It's all about developing new and improved types of crops with those traits we talked about. Better yields, better quality, resistance to those stresses, faster growth, wider adaptability, and those handy agronomic characteristics. It's a whole science dedicated to better crops.
Okay, that wraps it up nicely. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about crop production improvement. What's involved there?
It's all about the environment, really, giving the crops the best possible conditions to grow and, produce those great yields.
Okay, so we're talking about like the nitty-gritty of farming practices.
Exactly. Things like nutrient management, making sure the soil has what those plants need. Water, of course, is huge. And then even how we arrange the crops themselves can make a big difference.
Right, because plants are living things. They need the right food, just like us.
Yeah.
So Plant Nutrition 101, what are the essentials and where do they get all that stuff from?
Well, just like us, plants need a balanced diet. They pull nutrients from the air, the water, and of course the soil. Air gives them carbon and oxygen, while water supplies hydrogen. But most of those essential nutrients, those come from the soil.
So healthy soil, healthy plants. Makes sense. What are some of the key nutrients we're talking about here?
We got macronutrients, the big players: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Plants need those in larger quantities.
Wow, a mouthful. And other, like, smaller nutrients too?
Oh yeah, there are micronutrients. They're needed in smaller amounts, but still crucial. Think iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, molybdenum, chlorine. It's a long list.
It's like a whole periodic table for plants. So how do we make sure the soil has all that stuff? Just like sprinkle it on.
Well, we have two main approaches. Manure, which is, natural fertilizer from animals.
Right, good old-fashioned animal poop, nature's fertilizer.
Exactly. It's rich in organic matter and tons of nutrients. And then there are fertilizers, the commercially produced stuff, usually packed with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
Okay, so manure's natural, fertilizers are more like manufactured. But I've heard some not so great things about fertilizers. What's the downside there?
Well, if you use too much, they can actually harm the environment. Water pollution's a big concern. They can disrupt the soil's natural balance and even release those greenhouse gases we're always talking about.
Right, you got to be careful with those. So it's about using them responsibly, getting the benefits without, messing things up. Are there, like, alternatives, more eco-friendly ways to give plants what they need?
Absolutely. Organic farming's a great example. It focuses on natural inputs: compost, vermicompost, green manure, all those good things.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but remind me what they are exactly.
Compost is basically decomposed organic matter, your kitchen scraps, yard waste, all that, breaks down into nutrient-rich goodness. Vermicompost is compost that's been processed by earthworms, so even more concentrated. And green manure is where you grow certain plants, specifically to plow them back into the soil, adding organic matter and nutrients.
Wow, so many ways to feed those plants. But beyond food, there's water. And that's not always a given, especially in places where rainfall can be unpredictable.
Right, which is why we have irrigation. It's about ensuring a steady water supply for crops, no matter what the weather's doing.
I've heard of different irrigation systems like sprinklers and things like that. Can you tell us about the most common ones?
Sure. Canal irrigation's a big one, diverting water from rivers or reservoirs through, canals. Then there's well irrigation, where you pump water up from underground. And of course, sprinkler systems and drip irrigation, those are designed to be more efficient with water use.
So many ways to keep those crops hydrated. But even with the right food and water, there's more to it, right? Isn't there something about how we arrange the crops themselves?
You got it. Cropping patterns play a huge role. It's how we arrange and sequence different crops in the field.
Cropping patterns? I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Take mixed cropping, for example. That's where you grow two or more crops together on the same piece of land.
Like a plant party. But what's the benefit of that?
It reduces the risk. If one crop struggles because of pests or weather, the other might still do well, like a backup plan.
Right, diversifying your crops, spreading the risk. Smart. Are there other types of cropping patterns?
Yeah, we have intercropping. That's where you plant different crops in a specific pattern, often alternating rows. It can help with things like pest control and disease prevention.
So like strategically placing plants to keep each other healthy. Interesting. What else?
And then there's crop rotation, growing different crops in a planned sequence, one after the other. This helps improve soil fertility and also breaks those pest and disease cycles we talked about earlier.
Okay, so it's not just about what you plant, but how and when you plant it. A lot of strategy involved. But
yeah.
Before we jump to the next topic, can we just define what crop production management is, like the whole shebang?
Sure. It's basically the sum of all the practices we use to boost crop growth and yield. From managing nutrients and water to those cropping patterns we just discussed, it's about optimizing the whole growing process.
Okay, that makes sense. Now on to the threats. Every good story needs some conflict, right? So, what are the biggest baddies our crops have to face out there?
Oh, plenty of villains in this story. Weeds, for one, they're like freeloaders, stealing resources from our crops. Then there are pests, those pesky bugs that damage plants and spread diseases. And of course, diseases themselves, which can weaken or even kill crops.
So it's a constant battle to protect these plants. What are some of the weapons in our arsenal? What do farmers use to fight back against these threats?
Well, pesticides are a common tool, chemicals designed to specifically target those weeds, pests, and diseases.
Right, the chemical warfare approach. But I feel like I've heard some bad things about pesticides too. What's the catch there?
Yeah, they can have unintended consequences, they can pollute soil and water, harm beneficial insects, and even pose risks to human health. Not ideal.
So it's like we're trying to kill the bad guys, but sometimes we hit the good guys too. And ourselves in the process. Not great. Are there alternatives? More sustainable ways to protect crops?
There are. Integrated pest management's one example. It's about using a combination of methods, a more holistic approach.
Holistic, I like that. So what does that look like in practice?
Well, you might use biological control, which means introducing natural predators to control pests, or cultural control, adjusting planting times, or choosing specific crop varieties that are less susceptible to pests. And then there's mechanical control, physically removing pests or using barriers.
So it's like a multi-pronged defense strategy. Outsmarting those pests instead of just nuking them with chemicals. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Before we move on, can you define crop protection management for us?
It's basically everything we do to shield those crops from weeds, pests, and diseases. The goal is to minimize losses and ensure healthy, productive plants.
Okay, so we've covered the growing and protecting those crops. But the story doesn't end there, right? Even after harvest, there's still work to be done.
Exactly. We can't forget about storage. Proper storage is crucial to prevent losses and make sure that food actually makes it to people's plates.
Right. We don't want all that hard work to go to waste. So what are some of the challenges when it comes to storing grains? What can go wrong?
Well, grains are vulnerable, both to biotic factors, things like insects, rodents, and fungi. Those are always looking for a free meal.
Tiny little thieves?
Right. And then there are abiotic factors, like changes in moisture and temperature. Those can ruin grain quality, too.
So it's a battle against both those tiny invaders and the environment itself. How do we protect our grains?
Cleanliness is key. Making sure the grains are properly cleaned and dried before storage. Fumigation's another common method, using chemicals to kill those pests. And there are more natural approaches too, like airtight containers or using plant-based repellents.
So it's about creating a hostile environment for those pests while keeping the grains nice and safe. Makes sense. Okay, before we move on to animal husbandry, can we define storage of grains? Like, what does it entail?
It's all about those practices and techniques we use to protect harvested grains from going bad. Whether it's from those biotic factors, the insects and rodents and fungi, or the abiotic factors, those temperature and moisture swings, the main goal is to keep that grain high quality and usable for as long as possible.
Okay, that was a whirlwind tour of crop production and storage. Now let's switch gears and talk about animal husbandry. Why do we raise livestock? What role do animals play in the whole food resource picture?
They're a huge part of our food system. Animals provide us with milk, eggs, and meat, all essential sources of nutrition. And in some regions, they're also important for things like draft labor.
Right, animals do a lot for us. So what are some of the most common types of livestock we see in India?
Oh, we have a wide range: cattle, goats, sheep, poultry, fish. It's a diverse group.
Okay, let's start with cattle. What's the main purpose of raising cattle? Is it all about milk?
Well, in India, it's actually a 2-for-1 deal. Cattle are raised for milk production A&D for draft labor.
So they're a source of both food and power. Cool. Now, I know there are different breeds of cows, some known for their milk production. Can you tell us about those?
We have our indigenous breeds, like the Red Sindhi and Sahiwal. They're super resilient and adapted to local conditions. And then there are exotic breeds, like the Jersey and Brown Swiss. Those are known for producing tons of milk.
So local talent versus international superstars. Got it.
Yeah.
But what affects how much milk a cow produces? Is it all in the genes?
It's a combination of things, for sure. Breed definitely plays a role, but also their age, their diet, their overall health, and even the lactation period, which is how long they produce milk after giving birth.
So nature and nurture working together. Makes sense. What about milk quality? What makes some milk better than others?
The breed's a factor, but also what they eat, the hygiene practices on the farm, and the overall health of the animal. Healthy, well-cared-for cows produce better milk.
Right, it all connects. Now, what about breeding? Are there ways to, like, make those cows even better milk producers or improve other traits?
Absolutely. Crossbreeding is a common strategy, mixing indigenous breeds with those exotic ones to get the best of both worlds. You might get higher milk yields, better disease resistance, and cows that are more adapted to local conditions.
It's like genetic engineering, but the old-fashioned way. Neat.
Right.
But it's not just about genetics,
Yeah.
right? The living conditions and how they're cared for also matter.
Hugely. Proper shelter, hygiene, a good diet. All of that's crucial for healthy, productive cattle.
So what does that look like in practice? Give us the rundown on good cattle care.
Well, they need clean, well-ventilated sheds to protect them from the elements. Regular brushing helps remove dirt and loose hair, keeps them comfy. And proper waste disposal is essential, both for hygiene and preventing disease.
So it's about creating a comfortable and clean environment for them. What about their diet? What do cows need to eat to stay healthy and produce all that milk?
It's a mix of roughage, like hay and straw, which is high in fiber, and then concentrates, like grains and oilseed cakes. Those are packed with protein and other nutrients.
So a balanced diet, just like us, makes sense. But even with the best care, cows can still get sick, right?
Yeah.
What are some common cattle diseases and how do we prevent or treat them?
Unfortunately, yes. They can get parasites like worms and ticks. And there are infectious diseases too, like foot and mouth disease and mastitis. Good hygiene's the first line of defense, plus vaccinations and regular checkups by a vet. Being proactive is key.
So preventative care is super important.
Okay, before we move on to chickens, can we just define what cattle farming is? Like, sum it up in a sentence.
Cattle farming is all about raising cattle, whether it's for milk, meat, or draft labor. It involves every aspect of their care, from breeding to feeding to making sure they're healthy and well treated.
Let's fly over to the poultry world now. What's the main goal of raising poultry?
It's mostly about eggs and meat. And when we talk poultry, we're usually talking chickens. They're the most common type raised.
Right. Eggs from layers, meat from broilers. I know there are different breeds of chickens too, right? Some better for eggs, some better for meat.
You bet. Lots of variety out there. And just like with cattle, there are breeding programs to improve those breeds even further.
So always trying to make those chickens more productive, right?
Yeah.
What's the focus of those breeding programs?
Well, they're always looking to improve egg production, how fast the chickens grow, their resistance to diseases, and their ability to handle local conditions. Lots of factors to consider. So, similar goals to cattle breeding, making them more efficient and resilient. What about the differences between raising broilers and layers? Is the care pretty much the same?
Not exactly. Broilers, the meat birds, are typically slaughtered at a young age. Their diet's high in protein to help them grow quickly. Layers, the egg-laying chimps, need a different balance of nutrients to support egg production.
Right, different goals, different diets. What about housing and hygiene? What do those chickens need to stay healthy?
Ventilation's key. Their houses need to be well ventilated, clean and dry to prevent diseases from spreading. And regular cleaning and disinfection are a must, along with proper waste disposal.
So cleanliness is next to, well, healthy chickens. Got it. What about their diet? What do chickens eat?
It's a mix of grains, protein sources, vitamins, and minerals, all carefully balanced to meet their needs.
So chicken feed is a science in itself. But even with good hygiene and a balanced diet, chickens can still get sick, right? What are some common poultry diseases we need to watch out for?
There are a bunch, unfortunately. Viral, bacterial, fungal, even parasitic infections. They can get hit with a lot.
So how do we protect those birds?
The vaccination's crucial. And of course, good hygiene practices. Biosecurity measures to keep diseases out of the flock in the first place, and a balanced diet to keep their immune systems strong.
So a multi-pronged defense, just like with crops. Okay, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, can we define poultry farming, just to recap?
Poultry farming is all about raising domesticated birds, mostly chickens, for their meat and eggs. It covers everything from breeding and feeding to housing and keeping those birds healthy.
Okay, now we're diving into a whole new world. Fish. Where do we get most of the fish we eat?
There are two main sources. Capture fishing, where we catch fish from natural water bodies like oceans, rivers, and lakes. And then there's culture fishery, where we actually farm fish in controlled environments.
Wild-caught versus farmed fish. Okay, got it. Tell me more about capture fishing. What does that involve?
It's all about using different fishing gear. Nets, lines, traps, all sorts of things. You have small-scale fishing operations, and then there are huge industrial ones.
I imagine there are some concerns about sustainability with capture fishing, right? Taking too many fish from the ocean.
Yeah, overfishing's a big problem. If we catch fish faster than they can reproduce, it can wipe out entire populations and damage those delicate ecosystems.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Harvesting fish without destroying the resource. Makes sense. What about culture fishery? What's that all about?
Culture fishery, also called aquaculture or fish farming, is all about raising fish in controlled environments. Think ponds, tanks, cages, those sorts of things.
Okay, so we're controlling the environment. What's the advantage of farming fish compared to catching them in the wild?
Well, it can take some pressure off those wild fish stocks, which is good for sustainability. It also gives us a more reliable supply of fish and lets us manage things like water quality and fish health more closely.
So it's more controlled and predictable. Makes sense. What are some of the common methods used in fish farming?
There's pond culture, cage culture, and even integrated fish farming, where fish are raised alongside other agricultural activities like rice cultivation.
Integrated fish farming. That sounds interesting. Tell me more about that one.
It's a pretty cool system. Fish are raised in rice paddies or other fields using the water and nutrients from those crops. It's a win-win for both the fish and the crops.
So they're helping each other out. I like it. But are there any challenges with fish farming? Anything we need to be careful about?
Managing water quality is a big one. Fish produce waste, and if it builds up, it can pollute the water. And preventing diseases is another challenge. When fish are raised in close quarters, infections can spread quickly.
Right. Keeping things clean and healthy is key. Okay, before we wrap up this section, can you give us a quick definition of fish production, just to sum it all up?
Fish production is basically any activity related to getting fish for us to eat. It includes both capture fishing from those natural water bodies and culture fishery, where we farm them.
Okay, so we've covered fish, both wild caught and farmed. But there's one more creature we got to talk about when it comes to food resources, and that's, well, the bee.
Ah, bees. Tiny but mighty. They're not just about honey. They play a huge role in our entire food system as pollinators.
Right, the pollination power of bees. I've heard it's super important for crops, but can you remind me how that works again?
Pollination is basically how plants make babies, fruits and seeds. It's about transferring pollen from one part of the flower to another, and lots of plants rely on insects like bees to do that for them.
So bees are like tiny little matchmakers for plants, helping them reproduce. But how does that benefit us? How does that put food on our tables?
A huge chunk of our crops need insect pollination to produce what we eat. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, you name it. Without bees, we'd be in big trouble, food-wise.
Wow, so those buzzing little guys are more important than we realize. Okay, but besides pollination, bees also give us honey, right? What's the deal with beekeeping?
Beekeeping, or apiculture, is all about managing bee colonies, giving them a home, taking care of them, and then harvesting the honey they produce. And other bee products too, like beeswax and propolis.
So it's like a partnership, right? We take care of them, they give us honey. I like it. What kind of bees are used for making honey?
We have a bunch of native bee varieties here in India. The Indian bee, the rock bee, the little bee, those are the locals. And then there are foreign varieties like the Italian bee that have been brought in because they're really good at making honey. And they're not as, sting happy.
So a mix of local and international bee talent. Got it. Now, what makes some honey taste different from others? Is it just the type of bee?
It's all about the flowers, actually. The type of flowers those bees visit for nectar and pollen makes a huge difference. Different flowers, different nectar, different honey flavor, color, and even the aroma.
So it's like terroir for honey. Like wine, but with bees.
Cool. But there's got to be more to beekeeping than just setting up a hive and letting them do their thing, right? What does managing a bee colony involve?
Well, beekeepers provide those hives, of course, but they also have to keep an eye on the bees' health, deal with pests and diseases, and then extract the honey using special equipment. It's a combination of knowing about bee biology and having those practical beekeeping skills.
Sounds like a cool job. Part science, part art. Okay, before we wrap things up, can you give us a quick definition of beekeeping, just to summarize what we've learned?
Beekeeping, or apiculture, is the practice of managing bee colonies in hives or other structures. It's about producing honey, beeswax, propolis, and other bee products. But it's also about understanding bees, taking care of them, and making sure we're harvesting those products in a sustainable way. Awesome. Well, I'd say we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From plant biology to animal husbandry to those amazing bees, we've explored the challenges of feeding a growing population and some of the innovative solutions that are shaping the future of food production.
It's a complex system for sure, but it's fascinating to see how everything's connected, right?
Absolutely.
Huh.
A huge thanks to you, our expert, for breaking it all down for us. And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you've learned something new about the food we eat and the incredible effort that goes into getting it to our plates. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.